All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? I have Eclipse right there. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so for today, we will be going over the assignment. I just wanted to make sure everybody's following along. So feel free to ask questions. I know Alia, you made very good progress, and I know Gracie, she's also made some good progress. Anya, I know you're working on it. And this is a tough assignment, okay? But it's important that you kind of get an understanding of the assignment so that when it comes to FRC, right, where you'll be creating a lot more classes, you will be comfortable, okay? So we'll be going over the assignment. We'll talk about the classes that are involved. It's going to be mostly a refresher since most of you are kind of making progress on the assignment. Uh, as and when we go through some of the methods, feel free to ask any questions, and based on at least some of the questions I got, maybe I will touch base on some of the things that may be confusing to y'all. We also talk about encapsulation, polymorphism, and abstraction. It'll just be a refresher from last week. A quick Kahoot. I didn't touch base on interfaces last week. We will quickly do a quick intro to interfaces. Then we will see a little bit about files. How do we handle files? How do we read from files? How to write from files? And we'll also talk about exceptions. And I know, Anya, one of the question you had was in the last assignment, right? Where we, as part of the e-commerce application, we were asking some details from the user, like what is his email address, what is his first name. That information does not persist anywhere. Basically, what I mean is like, once you exit the program, that information is gone, right? But if you want the information to persist, that's why you'll use files. One of the things that we'll use files for in this assignment is I'll give you a file which has the list of books, right? So you'll read the list of books from your file and initialize your books array, or book list based on the file. Any questions on today's what we're going to cover? All right. So I'll be quickly going over the assignment. Let me close everything here. So as part of your assignment, right, it's an e-commerce application, and let me go and run it real quick so you can actually see what's going on. And it's not going to run all the way through because there will be methods that you will need to implement, right? So in order to run it, you will basically open the e-commerce app.java. And once you're on that file, you can go ahead and click run. That will start your program, okay? And you can see it will start your program basically since it has the main method, right? So that is the start to your program. The first thing it asks you is enter your name. You can enter something here. And like I said, this information does not persist anywhere, is not saved anywhere. As soon as the program executes, right, this information is gone, so there is no concern about any sensitive information being stored anywhere, So when the program starts, saying enter a name, I'm going to give it a name. I'll enter an email address. And right now it doesn't validate anything that it's a valid email address, so you can give anything you want. It's asking for some address. And then it prints the books that are in the inventory, right? So basically it prints the book details, like in this case, in this program, I'm just going to take a quick detour. And if you look at the e-commerce main app, right? So we created a book called the first inventory book, and I initialized it to, hey, I gave it an ISBN number. I gave it a name of how to program in Java. That's the author, the price, the category of the book, some description for the book. So I created first, I created a book, and then I created another book. And then I added these books to the book list, So it is basically printing out the details of these two books that I added to the inventory, okay? So basically it's printing out, hey, how to program in Java and how to program in C++. Then your program asks you to enter the ISBN number. So basically this is with the assumption that you are going to purchase a book, right? So let's assume I want to purchase this book. So I will give it that ISBN number. And right now it breaks because let me go run this again once more, sorry. So you give it an ISBN number, and it will still fail here because what happens is when I give it an ISBN number, you need to take that book from the inventory and add it to the users list. So that method that implements basically takes the book from the inventory and add it to the user is still not implemented, right? That's part of your exercise. So you'll get an exception right here. Okay. So in order to do the e-commerce app, right? So we initialized a class called book, and it has the ISBN number, it has a title, there's author, price, description, and the book category. And you have a constructor for your book. Basically, your constructor initializes the instance variables, right? So you want to initialize all these variables, and these are called instance variables, right? And then you can have some methods that basically for example, like in this case, I wanted to print the book details, right? So an example would be, hey, I'd have a print statement, and if I want to print the title, I would print the title like this. And this is basically accessing the instance variable, right? The title here. And the other one is accessing your ISBN number, okay? So the book class basically has a couple of methods like a constructor. It has a method to get the price. It has a method to get the print the book details. And just to touch base, like last time, we talked a little bit about encapsulation, right? And this is a kind of a refresher for encapsulation too. Ideally, like I said, you want to make these private, right? You do not want, like, for example, the ISBN number is not private over here, right? You want to make this ISBN number private so that if they want to access an ISBN number for the book, instead you have to provide a getter method that provides the ISBN number, okay? One of the reason we do that is so that nobody is accidentally modifying the ISBN number, right? So when I say why do you want to make sure that nobody's modifying this ISBN number, because you want to make sure the ISBN number is a valid number, right? So when the book is initialized, like part of our implementation will be, hey, initialize the instance variables and you can add validations you see fit, right? So for example, the price of the book should always be greater than 0. You can also add a validation that says ISBN number should not be null, right? So if at all those validations fail, you can throw an error, and we will actually see how do you throw an error. But for now, right, you can basically just add a printout statement that's saying, hey, your book is not a valid book, right? If you give access to these variables outside this class, right? After the book is initialized, anybody using this class can modify the ISBN number and it will become an invalid one, right? So you do not want to basically You do not want others to access the ISBN number, right? And any other private variables. So like last time, what we discussed is by making this private, you basically prevent access from other classes, The way you can give access, if at all you want, if you want to access the ISBN numbers from other class, the way you do that is basically by declaring a method called public string get ISBN, and then this will return the, okay. This is also a refresher for the encapsulation topic, okay? Any questions on encapsulation or any questions on the book class or any questions on why I want to make this ISBN number a private variable? Okay, looks like everybody's clear there. The next class is book list. And if you just take a step back, right, it basically contains an array of books, okay? The methods that I defined in my book list class, right? You may want to add a book. So by adding a book, I mean that you'll take a book argument, and you should basically add that book to the books array, right? And this is part of your assignment. Like I've given you the string set add books to the books array, and I've given you a sample to, the sample code is basically the actual code that you want to implement. So you basically take this bit of code and then just paste it there, and right, you can just paste it and that will be the working code, okay? In addition to adding books to the array, you want to increment this counter that says the current books array length, right? Right now, first when the books list is initialized, the value is set to 0. Whenever a book is added, you will add it to the index, right? So first time it will be added to the 0th index, and then you'll increment the counter, right? The next time this method is called add book, you'll add it at the first index, and you'll increment the books counter, okay? Print book summary, and this is where I think at least I got some questions. When I say print book summary, what do you mean, right? So basically, what I'm saying is I iterate over the books array, and on each book, call the method print book detail. Okay. So how do you iterate over the array? You basically use a for loop, right? You'll start with the index 0, and you'll go all the way to the length of the array. In this case, the length of the array is current books array length, and you'll increment I, right? And if you want to access each element of the array, right? You'll say books array of I, because your books array is nothing but your instance variable, right? And when you say books array of I, right? This will give you a book, right? So it'll give you an object of a book, right? Because this books array is nothing but an array of books, right? So each element in this array is a book, right? So since you got a book, right? Now you can call methods on the book. So if you go ahead and look and see, is there a method called print book details on the books class, right? So let's go back to the books class and see if there's a method called print book details, Yep, so there you go. There's a method called print book details, right? So that's what that's what I mean by, hey, iterate over your books array, and on each book, right, call print book details, okay? Any questions on this? I think Alia, I think you had some confusion over here, but I think based on my reply, I think you got this, right? Any more questions on this, Alia? Sounds good. I think this is another method that you have to implement. So basically what this method should do is it should get the book with the ISBN number, right? So the user is going to pass you the ISBN number. What you want to do is similarly how you have here, right? You basically want to iterate over the loop. And then you will get the ISBN number of each book, right, at the index. And if the ISBN number is equal to the ISBN number that is passed, you will basically return that book back, right? And point to note here, right? You do not want to break encapsulation, right? I'll show you an example that Gracie sent me, so for example, this is some example that Gracie sent me. She had a method called remove book on the books list class, okay? But if you see here, right, Gracie's accessing, she's getting the book at each index and she's calling ISBN number, right? But this breaks encapsulation, right? So what you want to do instead is you want to call the method that gets you the ISBN number. So you want to say something like get ISBN number or something, right? So that is the method. Instead of calling the variable, you're calling the method instead, so just be careful over here, right? I want you to make sure you are properly encapsulating things, right? So you should not be using the ISBN number directly. You should instead call the method that gives you back the ISBN number. Any questions on this get book with ISBN number? All right. The other class we had was e-commerce user. Right? So basically the e-commerce user contains email, name, address, and it also contains a book list, right? But this is when I say this book list, it's basically a checkout list or something, right? So this list is different from the inventory list, right? But you can kind of see we are reusing the book list class, right? We're creating another object of the book list class, So that is the power of object-oriented programming, right? You create a class once, but you can reuse it multiple places, right? So in this case, we are saying an e-commerce user contains a book list, right? And if you go back to our main program, we also said that, the inventory, right, is another book list, right? So you kind of see we're using the same class, right? And the book list methods can be reused to both places, right? So that is the power of object-oriented programming, right? You define it once, and then you can create objects and reuse the methods on the objects, okay? So you have the email, name, address, and the user's book list. Um, and I've given you a to-do to add implementations, right? You basically initialize your e-commerce user. So you'll say email equal to the email parameter that's passed. Then you'll say name equal to name parameter, address equal to address parameter. That will initialize your e-commerce user. The other method you have to do is print summary, right? So print summary basically, I want you to print out the books that the user has purchased, right? Uh, so basically the books that the user purchased are part of your user book list cart, right? Uh, it's pretty simple. I've given you an example implementation, right? You basically have to copy and paste this, and that is your implementation. And if you go back to your book list, right, user book list, it's nothing but user book list object is a member of it's of the type book list, right? And you can go back to book list and see if you have a method called print book summary. Right? So you have a method called print book summary. Okay, so you're basically calling that method to print the book summary, right? So you should not re-implement, right? If I tell you, hey, go ahead and print the details, right? You should not go ahead and use a for loop here, right? Instead, you just call the method because that method is already implemented in the book list, right? Similarly, when you want to add a book to the user's cart, this is the method that is getting called. So you basically here, you're going to say, hey, user book list cart dot add book, right? And that is the sample that I've already given you. You just copy and paste it. In fact, this just calls the method called add book in the book list class, okay? Going back to the main app. So here I'm creating a book, I'm creating another book. So we have two books here. And in the main class, right, I'm basically saying, hey, inventory. I'm creating an object called inventory. It's of type book list. Okay. And we know we have a method called add book, right? So you add the first book and you add the second book. At this point, your inventory is initialized, right? And the scanner, which we'll go over in a little bit, but the scanner is one way to take input, right? So you don't, at this point, you do not need to understand. It's just that, hey, I provided a mechanism to take the input. Like here you saw, you got the string enter name, right? Enter name. That's what this scanner bit of code is doing. As you enter the name, it's basically taking the name and storing it in a variable. Similarly, it's taking the email address and storing in a variable. It's taking the address and storing in another variable, right? So I can use all these three values to create an e-commerce user. So similar how I created a book, I'm going to create an e-commerce user. And then I said print book summary on the inventory, right? And that's what this thing is basically doing. It's basically printing the book summary. And if you go back to the inventory, right? Inventory is nothing but a book list. So it's calling that method called print book summary on the book list, right? It's basically printing this. Then it says enter the ISBN number of the book. Okay, so you would provide an ISBN number. And the reason it fails, right now you're getting an error here is because part of your exercise is to implement this method, right? So what you're doing is from the inventory, you're getting the book with that ISBN number, right? So this should basically give you a book back, and you want to add this book to the e-commerce user, right? Right now, this method is not implemented. That's why this error is being thrown. But once you basically implement this get book with ISBN number, it should add the book to the user's list, and then it should print the summary of the user, right? So basically, it should print all the books that the user has purchased. Any questions on that assignment? All right. If there are no questions, I did want to go over, like in the last week, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about abstraction. We talked about polymorphism. We also talked about encapsulation. So I wanted to go over those real quick, just make sure y'all did not have any questions. So encapsulation, the first thing, right? Encapsulation, right, let me close everything. All right. Encapsulation is basically you do not want users of your class, right, to access the instance variables directly, right? So you want to provide a get method, right, so that the users can access the variables through the get method. And the way to initialize your variables is through the constructor, right? So that is the proper way to do that, right? And you kind of saw in the e-commerce example, like how we are using encapsulation, right? We are using the constructors to initialize the variables. And like I told you, you should be using the get methods, like when you want to get the ISBN number, right? So unfortunately, I think this in here, right, I've not declared these as private, but so this is not a good example for encapsulation, right? You should make sure you basically make this private, so that other users cannot access these variables, okay? Then we wanted to talk about inheritance a little bit. Inheritance is basically code reuse. So by that, what I mean is, like, let's say we have a class called shape, and we wanted to reuse this method that prints the shape, right? When we defined a circle and when we defined a square. One way to make sure that the methods can be reused, right? The print shape method can be reused is by basically when you declare a square, when you create the class called square, you will extend to shape, right? So that basically means that you will get all the methods that are defined in shape within your method called square, right? So that is one way to reuse code, right? So that is what encapsulation is. And how do you do it? You'll basically say extends and the parent class, right? In this case, the parent class is shape, So by doing this, you'll get the method called print shape, right? Automatically within the square class. The other thing that we did is we said, hey, maybe, for the whoever wants to implement the shape, right? Like the square or the circle, we want to make sure they implement the method called area, right? So how did we do that? We defined an abstract method called area, and you see we did not provide an implementation, right? And whenever you make a method an abstract method, you got to make the class also an abstract class. That basically means that you can no more create an object of shape, okay? Instead, what you have to do is you have to extend shape, right? Square is actually something concrete. Extend a shape and then provided that method called area. And then users can now create objects of square. Okay. It's important thing to remember. If at all a class is abstract, you will not be able to create objects, right? So what do I mean by that? I cannot go ahead and say, hey, shape S is equal to new shape, okay? Instead, if you want to basically if you want to use a shape, right? The only way you can do it is you'll have to actually create a concrete class like square that extends shape and implement the abstract methods, right? And if I go back to shape, the abstract method was area, right? So you'll be forced to implement the method called area, right? And you can kind of see the override attribute over here that basically tells you, hey, this method is from your super class called shape. And now you can basically create objects of square, okay? And just to show that, just to show this in action, right? Like I said, you cannot create an object of shape, right? Because it's abstract, And you'll see that you get an error over here, okay? It's saying you cannot instantiate of type shape. That is because, shape is an abstract class, okay? If you want to implement, if you want to basically create a shape, what you have to do is create a concrete shape, right? You can create a square or a circle, and then you will implement, you'll extend shape, you'll implement the method that's abstract, and then you can create the object of that method, right? Like we saw here, okay? That basically covers abstraction. It does cover composition. Sorry, it covers encapsulation. And the last concept I think we are missing is polymorphism, right? What is polymorphism? Polymorphism basically means that, you can do different things based on the type of shape, right? So for example, uh, we know that, hey, we have an area method on shape, right? But the way the area is calculated for a rectangle is different from the way the area is calculated for a square, right? So you can basically do different things based on the actual class. Uh, and that is, I mean, it's just a term that it says, that is polymorphism. You basically can do different things based on the subclasses, right? So it's just a concept, so nothing much to remember there, uh, so any questions on the these three: encapsulation, polymorphism, and abstraction. And I think a lot of you are in FRC, right? The one thing that you will see, like this is an FRC, is the a robot code, okay? You can kind of see, hey, when you're creating the autonomous mode, right? You'll basically extend, you'll use the extends keyword, and you'll extend something called linear op mode, or there are other the operation modes, okay? But this is where, abstraction is used, and this is where inheritance is used, right? So they have already implemented some methods in this linear op mode, right? And if you kind of see this method called run op mode, what does it mean? Is basically this run op mode method is in the linear op mode method, sorry, linear op mode class, and they have not provided an implementation, right? Instead, they're asking you to implement that method, right? Um, and basically here you'll kind of initialize your motors, and then maybe if you have any sensors, right, you'll say, hey, you'll initialize your sensors, the light sensor and things like that, right? And then maybe you'll have some code that detects the distance between your robot and a target, right? So all that code should get implemented right here, But basically, what you have to know is, hey, the superclass like linear op mode has a method called run op mode, which you will have to implement, right? So the way they force you to implement is by saying, hey, go ahead and extend this class and create your own op mode instead, right? Any questions on inheritance? And this kind of shows you where exactly it kind of gets used in the in FRC, So, all right. So if there are no questions, I think we'll go ahead and start a Kahoot. And I think we have 8 members, so there are 6 people. All right. So it's a very simple Kahoot, So let's go ahead and get started on the Kahoot. Any questions before we start the Kahoot? All right. So I think my network is slow. Let's go and start this once more. Let's see if I can reload this. The network is really slow here. Or the Kahoot app may be having issues. Just hold on, guys. I think this is still processing. I don't know if it's going to refresh. Yeah, I think it's refreshing. All right. Okay, I think y'all can join. I hope this does not refresh. The pin is 9. All right, so for the one person who got it right, so inheritance is basically, you can use inheritance by using the extends, right? So if you're extending shape here, by that you're automatically getting all the methods in shape, right? Like for example, print shape, they're automatically accessible in your rectangle class and also the square class, right? So inheritance is a mechanism for you to inherit the attributes and methods from another class, okay? Yeah, and polymorphism is a little confusing, but the whole idea of by basically saying polymorphism is right. Hey, this area, right, can be different from a rectangle to what a square can do, right? So the implementation can be different, right? But at the end of the day, the method is called area, and anything that extends shape, right? We are just saying, hey, implement area, but the implementations can be different for different subclasses, right? So that's what polymorphism is, okay? It says to perform different tasks, right? Or it can be different algorithms for area, right? So All right, I think everybody's got it right except for one person, but like we saw it in abstract class, you cannot initialize an abstract class, okay? So in this case, we cannot initialize shape, right? So if you wanted to initialize shape, an object of shape, instead you have to create a class called square or rectangle or circle, right? Implement shape, make sure you implement the abstract methods, and then you can create an object of a square, rectangle, or a circle, right? So I think everybody's got it right. And the next question is going to be very similar, right? It just has one additional detail to it, you know. So if you kind of see the words repeated, it just has an additional detail, okay? All right, so an abstract method, right? In this case, the abstract method here, if I go back to shape, the area, right, is an abstract method, because how will you really calculate the area of a shape, right? Because you do not know it's a circle, square, or rectangle, right? So there's no way to calculate the shape, right? The area can be only calculated if you kind of know what it is, right? So that's why there's an abstract method. You do not provide the implementation. Instead, by you're saying it's an abstract method, and because we made the method an abstract method, so the class also has to be an abstract class. And the implementation, right, the square or the circle, when they extend this shape, they will be forced to implement the area method, okay? Uh, so you can define the abstract method can only be used in an abstract class, right? You cannot put you cannot say, just going back one thing more to say, like if at all there is another abstract method here in this square class, right, you'll have to make this class also an abstract square, okay? All right. So like we saw earlier, it can be only used in an abstract class, right? And it does not have a body. The body is provided by the subclass, right? So going back, just to reemphasize, right? The area was an abstract method, right? And because we are actually implementing this shape class, you know, you have to provide the implementation for the area method, okay? All right, I think that's pretty much it. Let's see who's on the top. All right, good job, Anya, Mira, Alia. So one thing I didn't cover last week is interfaces, okay? So what are interfaces? Interfaces are very similar to abstract classes, okay? So if I go back to the abstract class called shape, right? An interface is very similar to the abstract class. The only difference between interface and the abstract class is the interface will not have any implementation at all. It will, like for example, in this case, right, when we had the shape class, we had a method called print shape, okay? So this is a concrete implementation, right? Um, when we talk about an interface, everything is going to basically be a method without an implementation. That's what an interface is, okay? So let's say if I have an interface called shape, I think I need to do instead new interface. So if I create an interface called shape, What it means is basically it's going to just have public void area, something like that, you are not going to have any implementations at all. Okay, it's very similar to the abstract class. The only difference is you will not have any concrete implementations at all, right? So if I go back and try to create a method with an actual implementation that says print shape, it's going to throw an error. Okay, interface cannot have some concrete implementations. Okay, uh, so this is an interface, and you can have many methods in the interface. Okay. Like abstract classes, interface is another way for you to basically uh, force your implementers, right, to implement this method called area. Um, and the way you use this is very similar to abstract classes, right? If I go back to the square, right, just to make sure this method is different, right? I'll just say from interface. Okay. And the way you basically use this, right? So let's go back to shape and not shape, sorry. Let's go back to square, and I will say, hey, this implements uh, shape interface, right? Now it will tell you, hey, there are some methods in the shape interface that are not yet implemented, So we will have to implement that method, right? So you say add an implemented method. So if you see this method called area from interface, right? Now you're basically forced to implement this method, okay? And we probably know that this one needs to return a double, right? So let me go back and change it. And in this case, in this case, it's actually the same, right? This concept is the same, So interface is very similar to an abstract class. It also forces the subclasses to implement the methods. The only difference is like, you can implement multiple interfaces, but for the subclass, right, when you extend, you can only do one extends, okay? But for interfaces, you can implement a shape interface, you can implement like other interfaces too. So you can implement multiple interfaces, Uh, So, and most of the time in programming, you will be using interfaces rather than abstract class, right? There will be some instances where you'll have abstract classes, but most of the times, you'll want to implement a number of methods from different interfaces. So you'll say implement shape interface, things like that, right? So in your robot, right, you may have to say, hey, my bot implements the sound sensors, maybe, light sensors and things like that, right? By that way, you're forced to implement methods from the sound sensor and the light sensor and things like that, okay? That's the advantage of interfaces. Any questions on interfaces? And I think, Alia, last time you asked one question about abstraction and can you extend multiple shapes, right? Last time I told you if it's an abstract class, you can only do one extents, right? But as if an interface, you can do multiples, right? You can say implements interface, shape interface, and if you're another interface, right, you'll basically say comma, and you'll have the, you can say, you give the other interface too, okay? So that's the way you can use inheritance, right? And you want to implement multiple interfaces, So any questions on interfaces? And I think at least from the FRC aspect, you will not actually see a lot of interfaces, but in general, in the normal, like if you're doing bigger projects, right, you will see a lot of interface. In the FRC space, you will actually see a lot of abstract classes, because they have implemented a lot of functionality for you, and they will want you to implement small bits of functionality, right? That's why you see a lot of abstract classes instead, So, all right. Any questions on interfaces? Cool. Next, let's talk about files. And Anya, one of the questions you asked last time, right, is the storage, like whenever I was getting some information from the user, right, all this information, is this information stored anywhere or not, right? It is actually not stored anywhere, right? It is only stored when the program starts, right? It is stored for the duration of the execution of the program, right? So as soon as the program completes, these details like name and email address and address, they're no more valid, right? They're not stored anywhere. You know, if you want to store that information, right, that's why you'll use files. Or another use case for using files is if I go back to the e-commerce application. So in my e-commerce application, I initialize the objects of the book, right? Uh, but maybe I do not want to initialize my objects of the book like this, right? Because it's a little painful, right? I have to initialize maybe 100 objects, right? But instead, maybe what I may want to do is I will give you a file, right, which basically contains the details of the book. You may want to read the details of the book from the file and then initialize your book's objects, right? So that your inventory, right, can be initialized from a flat file that I provide you. Basically, when I say a flat file, I'll provide you a file where you'll have all these details: ISBN number, the name, uh, the the name of the title of the book, the name of the author, price, the category, the description, right? I'll provide you a file, and that file will contain all these details separated by a comma, right? So you'll have hundreds or thousands of books within that file, right? So you can read that file and then initialize your inventory from the file that I give you, right? So that is where you use files, you know. So it is a persistent storage, right? Basically, it persists. It is available during different executions, right? So if you start the program now and you stop it, right, and then that inventory is available, and like when you restart the program, the inventory is still available, right? So it is, files are persistent storage. Basically what I mean is between executions of your program, data in your files will still be there, right? So going back to your question, like when we start using files, right, if at all you're storing the user information that you take from the here, if you want to store the login information, you do not want to give any sensitive information at that point, okay? If you are using files, okay, and you're storing the user login information, okay? Any questions on where you use files? So files are just a mechanism for persistent storage, okay? And I do not know in FTC specifically where you will use files, but I know in FRC, I've seen them for some purpose, you know, they used to use files. I think they used to store some sensor information, like as and when they read the distance, you know, for some reason when they were using some light sensors, the distance they were storing in the distances, you know, they were storing in a file, and they had some other programs read that data from a file, right? So in some situations, I have seen that they use files for some odd reasons, you know. I don't know for the FTC, we will use files that much, you know, but it's just, I mean, just good to know the concept of where you use files, you know, just so you can be ready at all, if at all you need it, right? But in this assignment, we will be using files, okay? You will be using files to read the books, the details of the book, and instead, you know, once you know files, you'll basically get rid of this bit of code, and instead you will read all the details from the file, and you'll initialize the book object from the file instead, okay? So a quick program on how do you read from files. Okay. So before I go there, uh, start writing some code. Always, you know, you go back to the Java docs and see, hey, what is available in your file class, okay? Oops. All right. So if you do not know how to get here, you can go back to your Slack window, and you can like look at the pinned items, and in the pinned items, the first class, right? I already gave you, hey, here's the reference to your Java docs, okay? And you can go there, you can actually, so it'll take you here, and then you can search for the file class. I mean, you can go to all classes, and then you can search for the file class, right? And just we'll kind of quickly look at the, hey, what is available in the file class. So you see there's a constructor in the file class. It basically takes the path, right? So you will, if you want to read from a file, right? So you'll have to give the path of where you want to read from. So that will create a file instance. And there are methods over here that kind of tell you, hey, can you write to the file? Can you read from the file? But basically when you're reading, right, we will use the scanner instead to read, okay? So let me go back and see if I can go ahead and pull up the scanner class. And the way you use a scanner, right, is something like this, okay? So you'll create a scanner, and you can see that you can pass a file object, right? When you see a new file, that basically creates a file object. And the scanner has a method called hasNext, okay? That basically tells you, hey, is there a next line or not, okay? And if there is a next line, it returns true, okay? And then you can use a while loop to say, hey, if at all the value is true, right, go within the loop. And once you go in the loop, you will say, hey, get line, okay? Sorry, next line or something like that, So that will get you the next line in your file. You can get the value printed, right? And then you can do this in a while loop. So as long as there are more lines to read, right? Has next line will give you true, and then it'll read the line and it'll go in that loop, okay? So for the purpose of this, right, I've created a test. I've created a test file, okay? And just bear with me. I know y'all are using Windows, so just bear with me, and don't worry about what I am doing. So I have a file called sample.txt, okay, with these in my sample.txt, okay. The goal is for me to read these lines in the file and print it out on the console, okay. Just to show you how you can use a file, okay. So let's go ahead and start putting some code to read the contents of the file and print the contents, okay. So I'm going to have a sample. I just created a sample called e-commerce app database. I call it app database because a file is equivalent to, hey, a database, right? When I say a database, it's basically something that stores your data, right? This will be a starting point so that you can use this in your program. So I'm going to create a main method. And like we saw, right, we can create a file object. So I'd say file equal to new file. And if you go back to our constructor in the file class, oops, sorry. If you see, like here, we are calling the constructor, right? You see that we can pass the path, right? So let me go back to the constructor of the file class. All right, so this is the file class, right? And if I look at the constructor of the file class, there is a constructor that I can call which takes the path of the file, right? So that's the constructor I'm calling. So I have to pass the path. In this case, I'm just going to give it the path, and in your case, it'll be different, right? You'll have something like C, documents, and then path of your file, okay? Here I know, hey, there's a file called sample.txt in the Java courses directory, right? So, so in the Java courses, there is a sample.txt. So I'm creating a file object, okay? And I said, we'll use a scanner, right? And part of using a scanner, so the way we use a scanner is basically, you see when you use a scanner, you can basically pass a file object, right? So that's what I'm going to do. We're going to use the scanner so that we can iterate over the contents of the file, right? A scanner basically use scanners when you basically want to read line by line, okay? So we have created a scanner, and then instead of new file, right, I'll basically just pass the file that we just created. Okay. And the way to read the file, right, is basically we want to use a while loop. And we'll say SC, we're going to call the scanner. And just look at what the scanner has, right? It has an has next. And if you keep going down, there's something called has next line, right? Which returns true or false, If you're at the end of the file, it returns false, right? But if you're at the starting of your file, it will return true. So we'll call this method called has next line. And then if it is true, right, what do we want to do? We want to basically go within the while loop, right? And we'll see what the scanner has, right? I'm going to see, hey, there's a next method. There are a couple of other methods with next. And there is a method called next line, right? So this seems like a good one to use. So we'll call the method called get next line with the assumption that this will return the line in the file, right? So let's go ahead and store this in a variable. And let's say we want to print this out. Okay, that's pretty much it. And there's an error over here. For now, don't worry about this error, and we will be talking about exceptions very soon. So for now, don't worry about this. So for now, I'm going to say throws exceptions so that the error goes away. But before the class ends, we'll talk about the exceptions, okay? So let's go ahead and see when we run this, right, what happens. So you see, it basically prints the contents from the file, right? So it's reading each line and it's printing all the contents from the file. Any questions on how you read from files? Alia, Anya, Claire, any questions on this? Or Neil?
No.
All right, sounds good. It's pretty simple. So you create a file object, right? And we basically looked at the scanner. We saw that the scanner can take a file object. So whenever you do iterative operations, right, scanner is one good thing to always keep in mind, okay? When you want to take input from the user or when you want to iterate over contents, right? So you can use the methods on the scanner. This has next line gives you, hey, is there more lines to read from the file or not, right? If it returns true, you basically want to go into the while loop and you want to get the line. And maybe in this case, I'm just printing the line, okay? So as part of your exercise, right, what you'll have in your flat file will be, you'll have the details of a book, right? So you will basically get one line from the file, and then maybe you'll use a string operator, right? You'll use a method. So you'll basically get a string. Maybe you can look at your string class. see if there's a method that basically separates that string, right, into, and it gives you just the, separates the string by comma, right? And then you can say, hey, give me the first value, give me the second value, and things like that, just to put some sample code in here. Maybe even your flat file will have something like, so ISBN number, the author, maybe the title, right? So that will be the structure of the file. So let's say put some values here, ISBN 001, the author is John, the title is How to Program in Java, okay? So you'll have in the file, maybe I'll have more lines over there, right? So you'll have ISBN 2, so something like that, right? So when you read the file, initially you'll get this one, but you see this is a big string, right? So you'll want to see, hey, how do I read the string, right? So when you say next line, right, you'll get this line. So, but this is a string, right? Like how we saw. So you'll read the string and you'll want to see, is there a method called separate or split on the strings, right? So I'm assuming there will be a method called split on the strings. And let's just go real quick and let's go and see if there's a method called split on the strings, right? So let's see, string. And let's say if there's a method called split. Yep, there's a method called split, and you can see it basically gives you back an array of strings, right? So just putting some sample code in here, right? So you'll say, so you'll read the file, right? And then you'll say line from file dot split. And the regex is just the pattern. So in this case, you will want to split by a comma. Okay. And then, so this will give you an array, right? So if you kind of look at the description of this, so it's going to give you back a string array, okay? So you will store it in a string array. Okay. So basically when you do this, right, what the outcome will be is, if you just look at the execution of the program, it will be something like this, of 0, the value will be okay. If you look at the details, right, this is what you're internally, right? When you look at your details of book array, at the 0th element, it will store you the ISBN number, right? So basically, just to take a step back, right? You initially, when you do next line, right? When you're reading the contents from the file, you'll basically get this, but we know, hey, we want to split this out because these are the details of the book, right? And the way to split it is, we know, hey, they are separated by a comma, right? So we are saying this, whatever string we got, we're going to split it out. And when we call split is going to give us an array, right? So we know that, hey, the 0th index is the ISBN number, the first index is the title, sorry, the author, and the second index is the title, right? So when you create your book, right, let's assume you're going to create your book class, right? So you'll do something like this, book, new book equal to let's say, so I'm going to suggest a book, and you'll basically say, hey, I know that is the ISBN number, comma, I mean, this the sample, right? Just because I just have 3 fields, I'm initializing a book with just the 3 fields, right? But in your case, this file will have a lot more, right? I know because in our book we have like 6 or 7 fields, so we'll make the assumption that we'll have all these 7 fields within the file, so that when you create the book, right, you have all the details that are necessary to create the book. Any questions? What I would want you to do in your exercise? So just to go back, right, in your e-commerce app right now, we have initialized the book manually here, right? Instead, what we will do is we'll change our implementation a little bit, right? So instead, I'll give you a file which has all the details of the book. So you'll read from the file, you'll get each line, and then you'll split out the contents of each line. And then based on the contents, you can initialize the book, right? By knowing, hey, the 0th index is the title, so maybe that is the first parameter I need to pass. The first one may be the 0th index is the ISBN number, the first index is the author, and the second index is the title, So that's how you're going to use it in your exercise, okay? But this kind of gives you an example of how do you read from files. Any questions on this, on the file reader? Okay. The next thing I want to show you is the file writer. It's actually really, really, really simple. So public static void main. So there is already a method called, there's already something that is provided that is called a file writer. So we are going to use that class to basically write to a file, okay? So you can kind of see, you basically have a constructor where you can pass the file or file object, or you have a constructor where you can just basically give it the path of the file, okay? So we'll go ahead and use that method, that constructor to basically initialize the file writer. And as we go down, we look at the methods that we can use in this. Where are the methods? Yeah, so basically it's saying, hey, these methods are already implemented from another class, but you have the write method, okay? So you can call the write method that you can use to write to the file, okay? And this is an example of where abstraction is kind of used, okay? So going back, let's see if we can go ahead and create a file writer instead. So file writer. And like we said, we can either pass the path, right? So let's go ahead and get the path here. So let's say I want to write it to sample 01. Okay, and like we saw before, there's an exception thrown, and we'll talk about exceptions in 2 minutes. So for now, I'm just going to say throws exception. Okay. File to write dot. There's a method called write, which you can call, and you basically say, hey, you can write the contents to a file. Okay, so let's say in this case, I want to write. I just want to write that string, and I think in a file writer, just be careful. You always have to call the close method, otherwise the contents will not be written to a file. Okay, so let's go and execute this program. Very simple. You create a file writer object, you call the write method, and then you make sure that, especially when you're writing to the file, you got to call the close method, okay? Obviously, we didn't print anything out, right? So it didn't print anything. Let's go ahead and have print statement here. Okay, so it's done writing since we already have the program to read from the file, right? So let's go ahead and see if the contents are written to the file, okay? Cool. So basically, we wrote this to the file, right? And we're reading it back, so we know our program works, okay? And these are all available in the W3 schools, right? So if you go back to W3 schools, are the regular reference. So you can kind of see, hey, all this code is available. Okay, so I'll probably not be sending this to you because there's a reference in W3 schools. Okay. Any questions on files? All right, the last thing we will cover, I think we have 5 more minutes, and this last thing is very important, and you'll see this all over the place. It's called exceptions, okay? So an exception is basically when you want to handle errors, okay? That's what an exception is. Like, so for example, right, let's take this file thing. So whenever a file is created, if you do not pass a valid file name, right, an exception could be thrown. Basically, what I mean is an error can be thrown. Okay. Going back to your e-commerce program, right? Let's say if you want to, when the book class is initialized, right, and any invalid value is passed, like let's say ISBN number or title, let's say if those are null and you do not want those to be empty, the proper way to do that would be to basically create an exception and throw that exception, okay? So that's where exceptions are used. Anytime you want to handle error cases, that's where you use exceptions. Whenever an exception is thrown, right? Whenever there's an exception can occur, you as the implementer of the program will be forced to handle it, okay? So for example, right, let me take this exception out. So here they are saying that, hey, this, when you create a scanner, there can be an exception thrown, okay? So the way you have to handle the exception is basically by putting a try catch block. So you'll say try, and then you take all your code and put it within your try block. You'll say catch exception E. And in this case, let me say, hey, I'm just going to print out the exception, okay? Sys out. So the way to handle an exception is basically by putting a try block, you do the try, you open the curly, close the curly, and then you have another, you open the curly, you close the curly right here, and then you say catch exception, right? That is the exception class, and the variable is called E in this case. And you can say, hey, in this case, I'm not doing anything with the exception. I'm just doing a print of the exception, right? So if at all this file, when you create a file, right, if at all the path is invalid, what happens is an exception is thrown. If there's a problem with the scanner, an exception is thrown. You basically have to handle the exception. The way you handle an exception is by catching the exception, and you can put some code in here. In this case, I just want to just print it out, okay? So you will see exceptions a lot in your FRC, okay? What you have to note, the takeaway is an exception is generated whenever there's an error condition, right? The way to handle an exception will be by putting a try and a catch statement. And then, within the catch statement, you can either print it out or do something else that you want to do, okay? Most of the times you'll just print it out, okay? So that, later somebody can basically go and look at the logs, right? The console logs where the exception is printed, and they will see what the error was and they can fix it, okay? So at a high level, that is an exception, okay? So here we saw how to handle an exception, right? So the file was throwing file. When you create a file, there's a potential that an exception could be thrown. When you create a scanner, there's a potential that an exception can be thrown, okay? In your program, where would be a good case, right, to kind of create a new exception, right? So for example, when you're creating your book class and when the constructor is called, if at all any of these are invalid, you can create an exception, right? So I'm just going to add an example here saying that, hey, if let's say the price, right? The price that is passed, the price parameter is less than 0, maybe. Hey, if it's less than 0, I want to throw an exception, okay? And luckily Java has already provided me, there are different types of exceptions. I can just say throw new exception, and I can just provide a method that says, okay. You can do that. Or you can, another thing that you can do is also you can, there is another in Java, there is one specific thing that there's an out of the box exception that you can use. Instead of using the exception, it's called illegal argument exception. Illegal argument exception. I would say, this is the better one to do. Okay. And all right. So basically what we're saying is, hey, if the price is less than 0, right? What will happen is your book will not even be initialized. It'll just throw an exception. And what, excuse me. Here we are basically throwing an exception called an illegal argument exception, okay? This illegal argument exception is a special exception that is already provided by Java. And basically, when you throw that exception, you can kind of give it very specific message saying that, hey, the price is not valid, right? And what will happen here is if you throw this exception here, if at all you create a book class with an invalid value, this exception will be thrown, and you will have to handle it specifically in your e-commerce app, right? So basically, you'll have to say, hey, if you want to handle it correctly, right, you will come here and say, you'll say try, and in this case, we can say exception. But if you want more details, right, you can always, so instead of just putting this generic message, you can always say sys out e. There's a specific method that says get message, which will actually give you what error was in the program, okay? So if at all you did something like in your book class, right? If at all you did something like, hey, if the price was less than 0, throw an illegal argument exception, and basically specifically you're saying, hey, price is invalid, right? And if you go back to your main class, you put a try catch, and in the catch blocks, you're saying that, hey, e.get message, that will specifically print out saying that, hey, the price of the book was empty or something like that, you know? So that's the way to handle exceptions. The way to create exceptions is basically by using the keyword called new, throw new, and the exception you want to use, right? There are a lot of exceptions in Java, but at least, you know, for your purposes, I will say the one exception that you'll use pretty frequently is called illegal argument exception, okay? So I'm not going to go over all the exceptions, you know, you can kind of Google them, but just keep in mind that, you know, hey, this is an exception that you can use straight off. So as long as you know, hey, if at all there is an invalid value, I can use this. So in FRC or something like that, right? You can always create an illegal argument exception whenever there is an invalid value, okay? So you throw an exception in your specific classes. The main class, right? As always, the good practice for you is always to handle all these exceptions in the main class. The way you handle the exception is basically by putting a try and a catch. You catch the exception, and then you can basically print out the specific message. Yeah, I think we're over time, 4 minutes over. Does anybody have any questions about exceptions? All right, and I think we'll have office hours again on Thursday. So if anybody has questions about the assignment, right? Let me know. And as a bonus, if you want, right, you can remove this hard coding of the books and instead read from a file. And also as a bonus, you can all go ahead and add some verifications instead of just like, if a book is created with an invalid value, right? Instead of just doing a print statement saying that the price is not valid, go ahead and actually do an exception instead, so that, you know, an exception is thrown so that none of the program gets executed, right? As soon as the exception is thrown, the program just exits out, okay? Any questions? All right. I think we're done for today. The reminder, just if you have any questions, feel free to Slack me. Also, you know, make sure you try to get the exercise, the e-commerce assignment done, because it's kind of important when you do FRC or FTC, right? You'll be creating a lot of classes. You know, you want to understand how everything fits together. Okay. All right, students. I will see you Thursday if at all anybody has questions, or I will basically talk to you next week. Thank you. Bye.